Chapter 20 of Our Village, Volume 2 by Mary Russell Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 20. The Old Gipsy. We have few gypsies in our neighbourhood. In spite of our tempting green lanes, our woody dells and heathy commons, the rogues don't take to us. I'm afraid that we are too civilised, too cautious, that our sheepfolds are too closely watched, our barnyards too well guarded, our geese and ducks too fastly penned, our chickens too securely locked up, our little pigs too safe in their sty, our game too scarce, our laundresses too careful. In short, we are too little primitive. We have a snug brood of vagabonds and poachers of our own, to say nothing of their regular followers, constables and justices of the peace. We have stocks in the village and a treadmill in the next town, and therefore we go gipsy-less, a misfortune of which every landscape painter and every lover of that living landscape, the country, can appreciate the extent. There is nothing under the sun that harmonises so well with nature, especially in her woodland recesses, as that picturesque people who are, so to say, the wild genus, the pheasants and roebucks of the human race. Sometimes, indeed, we used to see a gipsy procession passing along the common, like an Eastern caravan, men, women and children, donkeys and dogs, and sometimes a patch of bare earth, strewed with ashes and surrounded by scathed turf on the broad green margin of some crossroad, would give token of a gipsy halt. But a regular gipsy encampment has always been so rare an event that I was equally surprised and delighted to meet with one in the course of my walks last autumn, particularly as the party was of the most innocent description, quite free from those tall, dark, lean, Spanish-looking men who, it must be confessed, with all my predilection for the caste, are rather startling to meet when alone in an unfrequented path, and a path more solitary than that into which the beauty of a bright October morning had tempted me could not well be imagined. Branching off from the high road, a little below our village, runs a wide green lane, bordered on either side by a row of young oaks and beeches just within the hedge, forming an avenue, in which on a summer afternoon you may see the squirrels disporting from tree to tree, while the rooks, their fellow denizens, are wheeling in noisy circles over their heads. The fields sink gently down on each side, so that being the bottom of a natural winding valley, and crossed by many little rills and rivulets, the turf exhibits even in the driest summers an emerald verdure. Scarcely anyone passes the end of that lane without wishing to turn into it, but the way is in some sort dangerous and difficult for foot passengers, because the brooklets which intersect it are in many instances bridgeless, and in others bestridden by planks so decayed that it were rashness to pass them, and the nature of the ground, treacherous and boggy, and in many places as unstable as water, renders it for carriages wholly impracticable. I, however, who do not dislike a little difficulty where there is no absolute danger, and who am moreover almost as familiar with the one only safe track as the heifers who graze there, sometimes venture along this seldom trodden path, which terminates at the end of 1.5 miles in a spot of singular beauty. The hills become abrupt and woody, the cultivated enclosures cease, and the long narrow valley ends in a little green, bordered on one side by a fine old park, whose mossy paling, overhung with thorns and hollies, comes sweeping round it to meet the rich coppices which clothe the opposite acclivity. Just under the high and irregular paling, shaded by the birches and sycamores of the park, and by the venerable oaks which are scattered irregularly on the green, is a dark, deep pool, whose broken banks, crowned with fern and wreathed with briar and bramble, have an air of wildness and grandeur that might have suited the pencil of Salvator Rosa. In this lonely place, for the mansion to which the park belongs has long been uninhabited, I first saw our gipsies. They had pitched their little tent under one of the oak trees, perhaps from a certain dim sense of natural beauty which those who live with nature in the fields are seldom totally without, perhaps because the neighbourhood of the coppices and of the deserted hall was favourable to the acquisition of game and of the little fuel which their hardy habits required. The party consisted only of 4. An old crone in a tattered red cloak and black bonnet, who was stooping over a kettle, of which the contents were probably as savoury as that of Meg Merrilies, renowned in story. A pretty black-eyed girl at work under the trees, a sunburnt urchin of 8 or 9 collecting sticks and dead leaves to feed their out-of-door fire, and a slender lad 2 or 3 years older, who lay basking in the sun with a couple of shabby dogs of the sort called mongrel, in all the joy of idleness, while a grave, patient donkey stood grazing hard by. It was a pretty picture, with its soft autumnal sky, its rich woodiness, its sunshine, its verdure, the light smoke curling from the fire, and the group disposed around it so harmless, poor outcasts, and so happy, a beautiful picture. I stood gazing on it till I was half ashamed to look longer, and came away half afraid that they should depart before I could see them again. This fear I soon found to be groundless. The old gipsy was a celebrated fortune-teller, and the post having been so long vacant, she could not have brought her talents to a better market. The whole village rang with the predictions of this modern Cassandra, unlike her Trojan predecessor, inasmuch as her prophecies were never of evil. I myself could not help admiring the real cleverness, the genuine gipsy tact with which she adapted her foretellings to the age, the habits, and the known desires and circumstances of her clients. To our little pet Lizzie, for instance, a damsel of 7, she predicted a fairing. To Ben Kirby, a youth of 13, head batter of the boys, a new cricket ball. To Ben's sister Lucy, a girl some 3 years his senior and just promoted to that ensign of womanhood, a cap, she promised a pink top-knot, while for Miss Sophia Matthews, our old maidish schoolmistress, who would be heartily glad to be a girl again, she foresaw 1 handsome husband, and for the smart widow Simmons, 2. These were the least of her triumphs. George Davis, the dashing young farmer of the Hill House, a gay sportsman who scoffed at fortune-tellers and matrimony, consulted her as to whose greyhound would win the Coursers' Cup at the Beacon meeting, to which she replied that she did not know to whom the dog would belong, but that the winner of the cup would be a white greyhound with 1 blue ear and a spot on its side, being an exact description of Mr. George Davis's favourite Helen, who followed her master's steps like his shadow, and was standing behind him at this very instant. This prediction gained our gipsy half a crown, and Master Wells, a thriving thrifty yeoman of the Lee, she managed to win 6pence from his hard, honest, frugal hand, by a prophecy that his old brood mare, called Blackfoot, should bring forth twins, and Ned the blacksmith, who was known to court the tall nursemaid at the mill, she got a shilling from Ned, simply by assuring him that his wife should have the longest coffin that ever was made in our wheelwright's shop. A most tempting prediction, ingeniously combining the prospect of winning and of surviving the lady of his heart, a promise equally adapted to the hot and cold fits of that ague called love, lightening the fetters of wedlock, uniting in a breath the bridegroom and the widower. Ned was the best pleased of all her customers, and enforced his suit with such vigour that he and the fair giantess were asked in church the next Sunday and married at the fortnight's end. No wonder that all the world, that is to say all our world, were crazy to have their fortunes told, to enjoy the pleasure of hearing from such undoubted authority that what they wished to be should be. Amongst the most eager to take a peep into futurity was our pretty maid Harriet, although her desire took the not unusual form of disclamation. Nothing should induce her to have her fortune told, nothing on earth. She never thought of the gipsy, not she. And to prove the fact, she said so at least 20 times a day. Now, Harriet's fortune seemed told already, Her destiny was fixed. She, the belle of the village, was engaged, as everybody knows, to our village beau, Joel Brent. They were only waiting for a little more money to marry, and as Joel was already head carter to our head farmer, and had some prospect of a bailiff's place, their union did not appear very distant. But Harriet, besides being a beauty, was a coquette, and her affection for her betrothed did not interfere with certain flirtations, which came in like Isabella, by the by, and occasionally cast a shadow of coolness between the lovers, which, however, Joel's cleverness and good humour generally contrived to chase away. There had probably been a little fracas in the present instance, for at the end of one of her daily professions of unfaith in gipsies and their predictions, she added that none but fools did believe them, that Joel has had his fortune told, and wanted to treat her to a prophecy, but she was not such a simpleton. About half an hour after the delivery of this speech, I happened, in tying up a chrysanthemum, to go to our wood-yard for a stick of proper dimensions, and there, enclosed between the faggot pile and the coal-shed, stood the gipsy, in the very act of palmistry, conning the lines of fate in Harriet's hand. Never was a stronger contrast than that between the old withered Sibyl, dark as an Egyptian, with bright laughing eyes and an expression of keen humour under all her affected solemnity, and our village beauty, tall and plump and fair, blooming as a rose and simple as a dove. She was listening too intently to see me, but the fortune-teller did, and stopped so suddenly that her attention was awakened and the intruder discovered. Harriet at first meditated a denial. She called up a pretty, innocent, unconcerned look, answered my silence, for I never spoke a word, by muttering something about coals for the parlour, and catching up my new-painted green watering-pot instead of the coal-scuttle, began filling it with all her might, to the unspeakable discomfiture of that useful utensil, on which the dingy dust stuck like bird-lime, and of her own clean apron, which exhibited a curious interchange of black and green on a white ground. During the process of filling the watering-pot, Harriet made divers signs to the gipsy to decamp. The old Sibyl, however, budged not a foot, influenced probably by two reasons. One, the hope of securing a customer in the newcomer, whose appearance is generally, I am afraid, the very reverse of dignified, rather merry than wise. The other, a genuine fear of passing through the yard gate, on the outside of which a much more imposing person, my greyhound Mayflower, who has a sort of beadle instinct, and drunkards and pilferers and disorderly persons of all sorts, stood barking most furiously. This instinct is one of May's remarkable qualities. Dogs are all more or less physiognomists, and commonly pretty determined aristocrats, fond of the fine and averse to the shabby, distinguishing with a nice accuracy the master caste from the pariahs of the world. But May's power of perception is another matter, more, as it were, moral. She has no objection to honest rags, can away with dirt or age or ugliness or any such accident, and except just at home, makes no distinction between kitchen and parlour. Her intuition points entirely to the race of people commonly called suspicious, on whom she pounces at a glance. What a constable she would have made! What a jewel of a thief-taker! Pity that those 4 feet should stand in the way of her preferment. She might have risen to be a Bow Street officer. As it is, we make the gift useful in a small way. In the matter of hiring and marketing, the whole village likes to consult May. Many a chap has stared when she has been whistled up to give her opinion as to his honesty, and many a pig bargain has gone off on her veto. Our neighbour, mine host of the Rose, used constantly to follow her judgment in the selection of his lodgers. His house was never so orderly as when under her government. At last he found out that she abhorred tipplers as well as thieves. Indeed, she actually barked away 3 of his best customers, and he left off appealing to her sagacity, since which he has at different times lost 3 silver spoons and a leg of mutton. With everyone else, May is an oracle, not only in the case of wayfarers and vagrants, but amongst our own people her fancies are quite a touchstone. A certain hump-backed cobbler, for instance. May cannot abide him, and I don't think he has had so much as a job of heel-piecings to do since her dislike became public. She really took away his character. Longer than I have taken to relate Mayflower's accomplishments, stood we, like the folks in the Critic, at a deadlock. May, who probably regarded the gipsy as a sort of rival, an interloper on her oracular domain, barking with the voice of a lioness, the gipsy trying to persuade me into having my fortune told, and I endeavouring to prevail on May to let the gipsy pass. Both attempts were unsuccessful, and the fair consulter of destiny, who had by this time recovered from the shame of her detection, extricated us from our dilemma by smuggling the old woman away through the house. Of course, Harriet was exposed to some raillery and a good deal of questioning about her future fate, as to which she preserved an obstinate but evidently satisfied silence. At the end of 3 days, however, my readers are, I hope, learned enough in gipsy lore to know that unless kept secret for 3 entire days no prediction can come true. At the end of 3 days, when all the family except herself had forgotten the story, our pretty soubrette, half bursting with the long retention, took the opportunity of lacing on my new half-boots to reveal the prophecy. She was to see within the week, and this was Saturday, the young man, the real young man whom she was to marry. Why, Harriet, you know poor Joel. Joel, indeed? The gipsy said that the young man, the real young man, was to ride up to the house dressed in a dark greatcoat, and Joel never wore a greatcoat in his life. All the world knew that he wore smock frocks and jackets, and mounted on a white horse. And where should Joel get a white horse? Had this real young man made his appearance yet? No, there'd not been a white horse past the place since Tuesday, so it must certainly be today. A good lookout did Harriet keep for white horses during this fateful Saturday, and plenty did she see. It was the market day at B, and team after team came by with 1, 2, and 3 white horses, cart after cart, and gig after gig, each with a white steed. Colonel M.'s carriage with its prancing pair, but still no horseman. At length one appeared, but he had a greatcoat whiter than the animal he rode. Another, but he was old Farmer Lewington, a married man. A third, but he was little Lord L., a schoolboy on his Arabian pony. Besides, they all passed the house, and as the day wore on, Harriet began alternately to profess her old infidelity on the score of fortune-telling, and to let out certain apprehensions that if the gipsy really did possess the power of foreseeing events, and no such horseman arrived, she might possibly be unlucky enough to die an old maid, a fate for which, although the proper destiny of a coquette, our village beauty seemed to entertain a very decided aversion. At last, just at dusk, just as Harriet, making believe to close our casement shutters, was taking her last peep up the road, something white appeared in the distance, coming leisurely down the hill. Was it really a horse? Or was it not rather Titus Strong's cow driving home to milking? A minute or two dissipated that fear. It certainly was a horse, and as certainly it had a dark rider. Very slowly he descended the hill, pausing most provokingly at the end of the village, as if about to turn up the vicarage lane. He came on, however, and after another short stop at the Rose, rode full up to our little gate, and catching Harriet's hand as she was opening the wicket, displayed to the half-pleased, half-angry damsel the smiling, triumphant face of her own Joel Brent, equipped in a new greatcoat, and mounted on his master's newly purchased market nag. Oh, Joel, Joel, the gipsy, the gipsy! End of chapter 20. Chapter 21 of Our Village, Volume 2 by Mary Russell Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. Little Rachel. In one of the wild nooks of heathland, which are set so prettily amidst our richly timbered valleys, stands the cottage of Robert Ford, an industrious and substantial blacksmith. There is a striking appearance of dingy comfort about the whole demesne, forming as it does a sort of detached and isolated territory in the midst of the unenclosed common by which it is surrounded. The ample garden, whose thick, dusty, quickset hedge runs along the high road, the snug cottage, whose gable end abuts on the causeway, the neat court which parts the house from the long, low-browed shop and forge, and the stable, cart-shed, and piggeries behind, have all an air of rustic opulence. Even the clear, irregular pond, half covered with ducks and geese, that adjoins, and the old pollard oak, with a milestone leaning against it that overhangs the dwelling, seem in accordance with its consequence and character, and give finish and harmony to the picture. The inhabitants were also in excellent keeping. Robert Ford, a stout, hearty, middle-aged man, sooty and grim as a collier, paced backward and forward between the house and the forge with the step of a man of substance. His very leather apron had an air of importance. His wife, Dinah, a merry, comely woman, sat at the open door in an amplitude of cap and gown and handkerchief, darning an eternal worsted stocking, and hailed the passers-by with the cheerful freedom of one well-to-do in the world, and their 3 sons, well-grown lads from 16 to 20, were the pride of the village for industry and good humour, to say nothing of their hereditary love of cricket. On a Sunday, when they had on their best and cleanest faces, they were the handsomest youths in the parish. Robert Ford was proud of his boys, as well he might be, and Dinah was still prouder. Altogether it was a happy family and a pretty scene, especially of an evening when the forge was at work, and when the bright firelight shone through the large unglazed window, illumining with its strange red unearthly light the group that stood around the anvil. Showers of sparks flying from the heated iron, and the loud strokes of the sledge-hammer resounding over all the talking and laughing of the workmen, reinforced by 3 or 4 idlers who were lounging about the shop. It formed a picture which in a summer evening we could seldom pass without stopping to contemplate. Besides, I had a roadside acquaintance with Mrs. Ford, had taken shelter in her cottage from thunderstorms and snowstorms, and even by daylight could not walk by without a friendly "How d'ye do?" Late in last autumn we observed an addition to the family, in the person of a pretty little shy lass, of some 8 years old, a fair, slim, small-boned child, with delicate features, large blue eyes, a soft colour, light, shining hair, and a remarkable neatness in her whole appearance. She seemed constantly busy, either sitting on a low stool by Dinah's side at needlework, or gliding about the kitchen, engaged in some household employment, for the wide open door generally favoured the passengers with a full view of the interior, from the fully stored bacon-rack to the nicely swept hearth. And the little girl, if she perceived herself to be looked at, would slip behind the clock-case or creep under the dresser to avoid notice. Mrs. Ford, when questioned as to her new inmate, said that she was her husband's niece, the daughter of a younger brother, who had worked somewhere London way, and had died lately, leaving a widow with 11 children in distressed circumstances. She added that, having no girl of their own, they had taken little Rachel for good and all, and vaunted much of her handiness, her sempstressship, and her scholarship, how she could read a chapter with the parish clerk, or make a shirt with the schoolmistress. Hereupon she called her to display her work, which was indeed extraordinary for so young a needlewoman, and would fain have had her exhibit her other accomplishment of reading, but the poor little maid hung down her head and blushed up to her white temples and almost cried, and though too frightened to run away, shrank back till she was fairly hidden behind her portly aunt, so that performance was perforce pretermitted. Mrs. Ford was rather scandalised at this shyness, and expostulated, coaxed, and scolded after the customary fashion on such occasion. Shamefacedness was, she said, Rachel's only fault, and she believed the child couldn't help it. Her uncle and cousins were as fond of her as fond could be, but she was afraid of them all, and had never entered the shop since she'd been there. Rachel, she added, was singular in all her ways, and never spent a farthing on apples or gingerbread, though she had a brand-new sixpence which her uncle had given her for hemming his cravats. She believed that she was saving it to send home. A month passed away, during which time, from the mere habit of seeing us frequently, Rachel became so far tamed as to behold me and my usual walking companion without much dismay, would drop her little curtsy without colouring so very deeply, and was even won to accept a bun from that dear companion's pocket and to answer yes or no to his questions. At the end of that period, as we were returning home in the twilight from a round of morning visits, we perceived a sort of confusion in the forge, and heard loud sounds of scolding from within the shop, mixed with bitter lamentations from without. On a nearer approach, we discovered that the object in distress was an old acquaintance, a young Italian boy, such a wanderer from the Lake of Como as he whom Wordsworth has addressed so beautifully. Quote, "Or on thy head to poise a show of plastercraft in seemly row, the graceful form of milk-white steed or bird that soared with Ganymede. Or through our hamlets thou wilt bear the sightless Milton, with his hair around his placid temples curled, and Shakespeare at his side, a freight, if clay could think and mind were weight, for him who bore the world." End of quote. He passed us almost every day, carrying his tray full of images into every quarter of the village. We had often wondered how he could find vent for his commodities, but our farmers' wives patronised that branch of art, and Stefano, with his light, firm step, his upright carriage, his dancing eyes, and his broken English, was a universal favourite. At present the poor boy's keen Italian features and his bright dark eyes were disfigured by crying, and his loud wailings and southern gesticulations bore witness to the extremity of his distress. The cause of his grief was visible in the half-empty tray that rested on the window of the forge, and the green parrot which lay in fragments on the footpath. The wrath of Robert Ford required some farther explanation, which the presence of his worship instantly brought forth, although the enraged blacksmith was almost too angry to speak intelligibly. It appeared that this youngster and favourite son, William, had been chaffering with Stefano for this identical green parrot to present to Rachel, when a mischievous lad running along the road had knocked it from the window-sill and reduced it to the state which we saw. So far was mere misfortune, and undoubtedly, if left to himself, our good neighbour would have indemnified the little merchant. But poor Stefano, startled at the suddenness of the accident, trembling at the anger of the severe master on whose account he travelled the country, and probably in the darkness really mistaking the offender, unluckily accused William Ford of the overthrow, which accusation, although the assertion was instantly and humbly retracted on William's denial, so aroused the English blood of the father, a complete John Bull, that he was raving till black in the face against cheats and foreigners, and threatening the young Italian with whipping and the treadmill and justices and stocks, when we made our appearance, and the storm, having nearly exhausted its fury, gradually abated. By this time, however, the clamour had attracted a little crowd of lookers-on from the house and the road, among the rest Mrs. Ford, and peeping behind her aunt, little Rachel. Stefano continued to exclaim in his imperfect accent, "He will beat me," and to sob and crouch and shiver, as if actually suffering under the impending chastisement. It was impossible not to sympathise with such a reality of distress, although we felt that an English boy, similarly situated, would have been too stout-hearted not to restrain its expression. "Sixpence," and "My master will beat me," intermixed with fresh bursts of crying, were all his answers to the various inquiries as to the amount of his loss, with which he was assailed, and young William Ford, a lad of grace, was approaching his hand to his pocket, and my dear companion had just drawn forth his purse, when the good intentions of the one were arrested by the stern commands of his father, and the other was stopped by the reappearance of Rachel, who had run back to the house and now darted through the group, holding out her new sixpence, her hoarded sixpence, and put it into Stefano's hand. It may be imagined that the dear child was no loser by her generosity. She was loaded with caresses by everyone, which, too much excited to feel her bashfulness, she not only endured but returned. Her uncle, thus rebuked by an infant, was touched almost to tears. He folded her in his arms, kissed her and blessed her, gave Stefano 50 for the precious sixpence, and swore to keep it as a relic and a lesson as long as he lived. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22 of Our Village, Volume 2, by Mary Russell Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22, Early Recollections, My Godfather's Manoeuvering. I have said that my dear godfather was a great matchmaker. One of his exploits in this way, which occurred during my second visit to him and Mrs. Evelyn, I am now about to relate. Amongst the many distant cousins to whom I was introduced in that northern region was a young kinswoman of the name of Harvey, Lucy Harvey, an orphan heiress of a considerable fortune, who lived in the same town and the same street with my godfather, under the protection of a lady who had been the governess of her childhood and continued with her as the friend of her youth. Sooth to say, their friendship was of that tender and sentimental sort at which the world, the wicked world, is so naughty as to laugh. Miss Reed and Miss Harvey were names quite as inseparable as goose and apple sauce or tongue and chicken. They regularly made their appearance together, and there would have appeared I know not what of impropriety in speaking of either singly. It would have looked like a tearing asunder of the double cherry, respecting which, in their case, even the seeming parted would have been held too disjunctive a phrase, so tender and inseparable was their union, although, as far as resemblance went, no simile could be more inapplicable. Never were two people more unlike in mind and person. Lucy Harvey was a pretty little woman of 26, but from a delicate figure, delicate features, and a most delicate complexion, looking much younger. Perhaps the total absence of strong expression, the mildness and simplicity of her countenance, and the artlessness and docility of her manner might conduce to the mistake. She was a sweet, gentle creature, generous and affectionate, and not wanting in sense, although her entire reliance on her friend's judgment and constant habit of obedience to her wishes rendered the use of it somewhat rare. Miss Reed was a tall, awkward woman, raw-boned, lank, and huge, just what one fancies a man would be in petticoats, with a face that, except the beard, certainly she had no beard, might have favoured the supposition. So brown and bony and stern and ill-favoured was her unfortunate visage. In one point she was lucky. There was no guessing at her age, certainly not within 10 years, nor within 20. She looked old, but with that figure, those features, and that complexion, she must have looked old at 18. To guess her age was impossible. Her voice was deep and dictatorial, her manner rough and assuming, and her conversation unmercifully sensible and oracular, full of wise saws and modern instances. For the rest, in spite of her inauspicious exterior, she was a good sort of disagreeable woman, charitable and kind in her way, genuinely fond of Lucy Harvey, whom she petted and scolded and coaxed and managed just as a nurse manages a child, and tolerably well liked of all her acquaintance, except Mr. Evelyn, who had been at war with her for the last 9 years on the subject of his fair cousin's marriage, and had at last come to regard her pretty much as Prime Minister may look on an opposition leader, as a regular opponent, an obstacle to be put down or swept away. I verily believe that he hated her as much as his kindly nature could hate anybody. To be sure, it was no slight grievance to have so fair a subject for his matrimonial speculations, a kinswoman too, just under his very eye, and to find all his plans thwarted by that inexorable gouvernante, more especially as without her aid it was morally certain that the pretty Lucy would never have had the heart to say no to anybody. Ever since Miss Harvey was 17, my dear godpapa had been scheming for her advantage. It was quite melancholy to hear him count up the husbands she might have had, beginning with the Duke's son, her partner at her first race ball, and ending with the young newly arrived physician, his last protégé. Now, he said, she might die an old maid. He had done with her. And there did actually appear to be a cessation of all his matrimonial plans in that quarter. Miss Reed herself laid aside her mistrust of him, and a truce, if not a peace, was tacitly concluded between these two sturdy antagonists. Mr. Evelyn seemed to have given up the game, a strange thing for him to do whilst he had a pawn left, but so it was. His adversary had the board all to herself, and was in as good humour as a winning player generally is. Miss Reed was never remembered so amiable. We saw them almost every day, as their fashion is amongst neighbours in small towns, and used to ride and walk together continually, although Lucy, whose health was delicate, frequently declined accompanying us on our more distant excursions. Our usual beau, besides the dear godpapa, was a Mr. Morris, the curate of the parish, an uncouth, gawky, lengthy man with an astounding Westmoreland dialect and a most portentous laugh. Really, his ha-ha was quite a shock to the nerves, a sort of oral shower bath, so sudden and so startling was the explosion. In loudness it resembled 6 ordinary laughs rolled into one, and as the gentleman was of a facetious disposition and chorused his own good things as well as those of other people with this awful catenation, it was no joking matter. But he was so excellent a person, so cordial, so jovial, so simple-hearted, and so contented with a lot none of the most prosperous, that one could not help liking him, laugh and all. He was a widower, with one only son, a Cambridge scholar, of whom he was deservedly proud. Edward Morris, besides his academical honours, I think he had been senior wrangler of his year, was a very fine young man, with an intelligent countenance, but exceedingly shy, silent and abstracted. I couldn't help thinking that the poor youth was in love. But his father and Mr. Evelyn laid the whole blame on the mathematics. He would sit sometimes for an hour together, immersed, as they said, in his calculations, with his eyes fixed on Lucy Harvey, as if her sweet face had been the problem he was solving. But your mathematicians are privileged people, and so apparently my fair cousin thought, for she took no notice, unless by blushing a shade the deeper. It was worth while to look at Lucy Harvey when Edward Morris was gazing on her in his absent fits. Her cheeks were as red as a rose. How these blushes came to escape the notice of Miss Reed I cannot tell, unless she might happen to have her own attention engrossed by Edward's father. For certain that original paid her, in his odd way, great attention, was her constant beau in our walking parties, sat by her side at dinner, and manoeuvred to get her for his partner at whist. She had the benefit of his best bon mots and his loudest laughs, and she seemed to me not to dislike that portentous sound so much as might have been expected from a lady of her particularity. I ventured to hint my observations to Mr. Evelyn, who chuckled, laid his forefinger against his nose, rubbed his hands, and called me a simpleton. Affairs were in this position when one night, just at going to bed, my good godfather, with a little air of mystery, no uncommon preparation to his most trifling plans, made an appointment to walk with me before breakfast, as far as a pet farm about a mile out of the town, the superintendence of which was one of his greatest amusements. Early the next morning, the housemaid who usually attended me made her appearance, and told me that her master was waiting for me, that I must make haste, and that he desired I would be smart, as he expected a party to breakfast at the farm. This sort of injunction is seldom thrown away on a damsel of 18. Accordingly, I adjusted with all dispatch a new blue silk pelisse, and sallied forth into the corridor, which I heard him pacing as impatiently as might be. There, to my no small consternation, instead of the usual gallant compliments of the most gallant of godfathers, I was received with very disapproving glances, told that I looked like an old woman in that dowdy-coloured pelisse, and conjured to exchange it for a white gown. Half affronted, I nevertheless obeyed, doffed the pelisse, and donned the white gown as ordered, and being greeted this time with a bright smile and a chuck under the chin, we set out in high good humour on our expedition. Instead, however, of proceeding straight to the farm, Mr. Evelyn made a slight deviation from our course, turning down the market-place and into the warehouse of a certain Mrs. Bennet, milliner and mantua-maker, a dashing, over-dressed dame who presided over the fashions for 10 miles around, and marshalled a compter full of caps and bonnets at one side of the shop, whilst her husband, an obsequious, civil, bowing tradesman, dealt out gloves and stockings at the other. A little dark parlour behind was common to both, and into this den I was ushered, and Mrs. Bennet, with many apologies, began, at a signal from my godfather, to divest me of all my superfluous blueness, silk handkerchief, sash, and wrist ribbons, for with the constancy which is born of opposition, I had, in relinquishing my obnoxious pelisse, clung firmly to the obnoxious collar, replacing them by white satin ribbons and a beautiful white shawl, and finally exchanging my straw bonnet for one of white silk, with a deep lace veil, that piece of delicate finery which all women delight in. Whilst I was now admiring the richness of the genuine Brussels point, and now looking at myself in a little glass which Mrs. Bennet was holding to my face for the better display of her millinery, the bonnet, to do her justice, was pretty and becoming. During this engrossing contemplation, her smooth, silky husband crept behind me with the stealthy pace of a cat, and relying, as it seems, on my preoccupation, actually drew my York tan gloves from my astonished hands and substituted a pair of his own best white kid. This operation being completed, my godpapa, putting his forefinger to his lip in token of secrecy, hurried me with a look of great triumph from the shop. He walked at a rapid pace, and between quick motion and amazement I was too much out of breath to utter a word till we had passed the old Gothic castle at the end of the town, and crossed the long bridge that spans its wide and winding river. I then rained questions on my dear old friend, who chuckled and nodded and vented 2 or 3 half-laughs, but vouchsafed nothing tending to a reply. At length we came to a spot where the road turned suddenly to the left, the way to the farm, whilst right before us rose a knoll, on which stood the church, a large, heavy, massive building, almost a cathedral, finely relieved by the range of woody hills which shut in the landscape. A turning gate, with a tall, straight cypress on either side, led into the churchyard, and through this gate Mr. Evelyn passed. The church door was a little ajar, and through the crevice was seen peeping the long red nose of the old clerk, a Bardolphian personage, to whom my godfather, who loved to oblige people in their own way, sometimes did the questionable service of clearing off his score at the Greyhound, His red nose and a skirt of his shabby black coat peeped through the porch, whilst behind one of the buttresses glimmered for an instant the white drapery of a female figure. I did not need these indications to convince me that a wedding was the object in view. That had been certain from the first cashiering of my blue ribbons. But I was still at a loss as to the parties, and felt quite relieved by Mr. Evelyn's question, "Pray, my dear, were you ever a bridesmaid?" Since, in the extremity of my perplexity, I had had something like an apprehension that an unknown beau might appear at the call of this mighty manager, and I be destined to play the part of the bride myself. Comforted to find that I was only to enact the confidante, I had now leisure to be exceedingly curious as to my prima donna. My curiosity was speedily gratified. On entering the church, we had found only a neighbouring clergyman, not Mr. Morris, at the altar, and looking round at the opening of another door, I perceived the worthy curate in a jetty clerical suit, bristling with newness, leading Miss Reed, beflounced and bescarfed and beveiled and beplumed, and all in a flutter of bridal finery, in great state, up the aisle. Mr. Evelyn advanced to meet them, took the lady's fair hand from Mr. Morris, and led her along with all the grace of an old courtier. I fell into the procession at the proper place, the amiable pair were duly married, and I thought my office over. I was never more mistaken in my life. In the midst of the customary confusion of kissing and wishing joy, and writing and signing registers and certificates, which form so important and disagreeable a part of that disagreeable and important ceremony, Mr. Evelyn had vanished. And just as the bride was inquiring for him with the intention of leaving the church, he reappeared, through the very same side door which had admitted the first happy couple, leading Lucy Harvey and followed by Edward Morris. The father evidently expected them, the new stepmother as evidently did not. Never had a thief taken in the manner seemed more astonished than that sage gouvernante. Lucy, on her part, blushed and hung back, and looked shyer and prettier than ever. The old clerk grinned. The clergyman, who had shown some symptoms of astonishment at the first wedding, now smiled to Mr. Evelyn, as if this accounted and made amends for it, while the dear godpapa himself chuckled and nodded and rubbed his hands, and chucked both bride and bridesmaid under the chin, and seemed ready to cut capers for joy. Again the book was opened at the page of destiny. Again I held the milk-white glove, and after 9 years of unsuccessful manoeuvring, my cousin Lucy was married. It was undoubtedly the most triumphant event of the good old man's life, and I don't believe that either couple ever saw cause to regret the dexterity in the art of matchmaking which produced their double union. They have been as happy as people usually are in this workaday world, especially the young mathematician and his pretty wife, and their wedding day is still remembered in W., for besides his munificence to singer, Rexton, sexton, and clerk, Mr. Evelyn roasted 2 sheep on the occasion, gave away 10 bride cakes, and made the whole town tipsy. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of Our Village, Volume 2 by Mary Russell Mitford. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. The Young Gipsy. The weather continuing fine and dry, I did not fail to revisit my gipsy encampment, which became more picturesque every day in the bright sun gleams and lengthening shadows of a most brilliant autumn. A slight frost had strewed the green lane with the light yellow leaves of the elm, those leaves on whose yielding crispness it is so pleasant to tread, and which it is so much pleasanter to watch whirling along, thin dancers upon air, in the fresh October breeze, whilst the reddened beech and spotted sycamore and the rich oaks dropping with acorns, their foliage just edging into its deep orange-brown, added all the magic of colour to the original beauty of the scenery. It was undoubtedly the prettiest walk in the neighbourhood, and the one which I frequented the most. Ever since the adventure of May, the old fortune-teller and I understood each other perfectly. She knew that I was no client, no patient, no customer, which is the fittest name for a goose-cap who goes to a gipsy to ask what is to befall her. But she also knew that I was no enemy either to her or her profession. For after all, if people choose to amuse themselves by being simpletons, it's no part of their neighbours' business to hinder them. I, on my side, liked the old gipsy exceedingly. I liked both her humour and her good humour, and had a real respect for her cleverness. We always interchanged a smile and a nod, meet where we might. May, too, had become accustomed to the whole party. The gift of a bone from the cauldron, a bare bone, your well-fed dog likes nothing so well as such a windfall, and if stolen, the relish is higher. A bare bone brought about the reconciliation. I am sorry to accuse May of accepting a bribe, but such was the fact. She now looked at the fortune-teller with great complacency, would let the boys stroke her long neck, and in her turn would condescend to frolic with their shabby curs, who, trained to a cat-like caution and mistrust of their superiors, were as much alarmed at her advances as if a lioness had offered herself as their playfellow. There was no escaping her civility, however, so they submitted to their fate, and really seemed astonished to find themselves alive when the gambol was over. One of them, who from a tail turned over his back like a squirrel and an amazingly snub nose, had certainly some mixture of the pug in his composition, took a great fancy to her when his fright was past, which she repaid by the sort of scornful kindness, the despotic protection proper to her as a beauty and a favourite and a high-blooded greyhound, always a most proud and stately creature. The poor little mongrel used regularly to come jumping to meet her, and she as regularly turned him over and over and over, and round and round and round, like a teetotum. He liked it, apparently, for he never failed to come and court the tossing whenever she went near him. The person most interesting to me of the whole party was the young girl. She was remarkably pretty, and of the peculiar prettiness which is so frequently found amongst that singular people. Her face resembled those which Sir Joshua has often painted, rosy, round and bright, set in such a profusion of dark curls, lighted by such eyes and such a smile. And she smiled whenever you looked at her, she couldn't help it. Her figure was light and small, of low stature, and with an air of great youthfulness. In her dress she was, for a gipsy, surprisingly tidy. For the most part, that ambulatory race have a preference for rags as forming their most appropriate wardrobe, being a part of their tools of trade, their insignia of office. I do not imagine that Harriet's friend, the fortune-teller, would have exchanged her stained, tattered cloak for the thickest and brightest red cardinal that ever came out of a woollen draper's shop. And she would have been a loser if she had. Take away that mysterious mantle, and a great part of her reputation would go too. There is much virtue in an old cloak. I question if the simplest of her clients, even Harriet herself, would have consulted her in a new one. But the young girl was tidy, not only accurately clean, and with clothes neatly and nicely adjusted to her trim little form, but with the rents darned and the holes patched, in a way that I should be glad to see equalled by our own villagers. Her manners were quite as un-gipsy-like as her apparel, and so was her conversation, for I could not help talking to her, and was much pleased with her frankness and innocence, and the directness and simplicity of her answers. She was not the least shy. On the contrary, there was a straightforward look, a fixing of her sweet eyes full of pleasure and reliance right upon you, which in the description might seem almost too assured, but which in reality no more resembled vulgar assurance than did the kindred artlessness of Shakespeare's Miranda. It seems strange to liken a gipsy girl to that loveliest creation of genius, but I never saw that innocent gaze without being sure that just with such a look of pleased attention, of affectionate curiosity, did the island princess listen to Ferdinand. All that she knew of her little story she told without scruple, in a young liquid voice, and with a little curtsy between every answer that became her extremely. Her name, said she, was Fanny. She had no father or mother, they were dead, and she and her brothers lived with her grandmother. They lived always out of doors, sometimes in one place, sometimes in another, but she should like always to live under that oak tree, it was so pleasant. Her grandmother was very good to them all, only rather particular. She loved her very much, and she loved Dick, her eldest brother, though he was a sad, unlucky boy, to be sure. She was afraid he would come to some bad end. And indeed, Dick at that moment seemed in imminent danger of verifying his sister's prediction. He had been trying for a gleaning of nuts among the tall hazels on the top of a bank, which, flanked by a deep ditch, separated the coppice from the green. We had heard him for the last 5 minutes, smashing and crashing away at a prodigious rate, swinging himself from stalk to stalk, and tugging and climbing like a sailor or a monkey. And now, at the very instant of Fanny's uttering this prophecy, having missed a particularly venturesome grasp, he was impelled forward by the rebound of the branches and fell into the ditch with a tremendous report, bringing half the nuttery after him, and giving us all a notion that he'd broken his neck. His time, however, was not yet come. He was on his feet again in half a minute, and in another half-minute we again heard him rustling among the hazel boughs. And I went on with our talk, which the fright and scolding consequent upon this accident had interrupted. My readers are of course aware that when anyone meets with a fall, the approved medicament of the most affectionate relatives is a good dose of scolding. She liked Dick, she continued, in spite of his unluckiness. He was so quick and good-humoured, but the person she loved most was her youngest brother Willie. Willie was the best boy in the world. He would do anything she told him. Indeed, the poor child was in the very act of picking up acorns under her inspection to sell, as I afterwards found in the village. He never got into mischief or told a lie in his life. She had had the care of him ever since he was born, and she wished she could get him a place. By this time the little boy had crept towards us, and, still collecting the acorns in his small brown hands, had turned up his keen, intelligent face, and was listening with great interest to our conversation. "A place?" said I, much surprised. "Yes," replied she firmly, "a place. 'Twould be a fine thing for my poor Willie to have a house over him in the cold winter nights." And with a grave tenderness that might have beseemed a young mother, she stooped her head over the boy and kissed him. "Oh, but you sleep out of doors in the cold winter nights, Fanny?" "Oh, me? Oh, I don't mind it, and sometimes we creep into a barn. Oh, but poor Willie, if I could but get Willie a place, my lady." This "my lady," the first gipsy word that Fanny had uttered, lost all that it would have had of unpleasing in the generosity and affectionateness of the motive. I could not help promising to recommend her Willie, although I could not hold out any very strong hopes of success, and we parted. Fanny followed me with thanks upon thanks almost to the end of the lane. 2 days after, I again saw my pretty gipsy. She was standing by the side of our gate, too modest even to enter the court, waiting for my coming out to speak to me. I brought her into the hall, and was almost equally delighted to see her and to hear her news, for although I had most faithfully performed my promise by mentioning Master Willie to everybody likely to want a servant of his qualifications, I had seen enough in the course of my canvass to convince me that a gipsy boy of 8 years old would be a difficult protégé to provide for. Fanny's errand relieved my perplexity. She came to tell me that Willie had gotten a place. That Thomas Lamb, my lord's head gamekeeper, had hired him to tend his horse and his cow, and serve the pigs and feed the dogs, and dig the garden, and clean the shoes and knives, and run errands. In short, to be a man of all work. Willie was gone that very morning. He'd cried to part with her, and she had almost cried herself. She should miss him so. He was like her own child. But then it was such a great place, and Thomas Lamb seemed such a kind master. Talked of new clothing him, and meant him to wear shoes and stockings, and was very kind indeed. But poor Willie had cried sadly at leaving her, and the sweet matronly elder sister fairly cried too. I comforted her all I could, first by praises of Thomas Lamb, who happened to be of my acquaintance, and was indeed the very master whom, had I had the choice, I would have selected for Willie, and secondly, by the gift of some unconsidered trifles, which one should have been ashamed to offer to any one who had ever had a house over her head, but which the pretty gipsy girl received with transport, especially some working materials of the commonest sort. Poor Fanny had never known the luxury of a thimble before. It was as new to her fingers as shoes and stockings were likely to be to Willie's feet. She forgot her sorrows, and tripped home to her oak tree, the happiest of the happy. Thomas Lamb, Willie's new master, was, as I have said, of my acquaintance. He was a remarkably fine young man, and as well-mannered as those of his calling usually are. Generally speaking, there are no persons, excepting real gentlemen, so gentlemanly as gamekeepers. They keep good company. The beautiful and graceful creatures whom they at once preserve and pursue, and the equally noble and generous animals whom they train, are their principal associates, and even by their masters they are regarded rather as companions than as servants. They attend them in their sports more as guides and leaders than as followers, pursuing a common recreation with equal enjoyment, and often with superior skill. Gamekeepers are almost always well behaved, and Thomas Lamb was eminently so. He had quite the look of a man of fashion, the person, the carriage, the air. His figure was tall and striking, his features delicately carved, with a paleness of complexion and a slight appearance of ill health that added to their elegance. In short, he was exactly what the ladies would have called interesting in a gentleman, and the gentleness of his voice and manner, and the constant propriety of his deportment tended to confirm the impression. Luckily for him, however, this delicacy and refinement lay chiefly on the surface. His constitution, habits, and temper were much better fitted to his situation, much hardier and heartier than they appeared to be. He was still a bachelor, and lived by himself in a cottage almost as lonely as if it had been placed in a desert island. It stood in the centre of his preserves, in the midst of a wilderness of coppice and woodland, accessible only by a narrow winding path, and at least a mile from the nearest habitation. When you had threaded the labyrinth and were fairly arrived in Thomas's dominion, it was a pretty territory. A low thatched cottage, very irregularly built, with a porch before the door, and a vine half covering the casements, a garden a good deal neglected. Thomas Lamb's 4-footed subjects, the hares, took care to eat up all his flowers. Hares are animals of taste, and are particularly fond of pinks and carnations, the rogues. An orchard and a meadow completed the demesne. There was also a commodious dog kennel, and a stable, of which the outside was completely covered with the trophies of Thomas's industry. Kites, jackdaws, magpies, hawks, crows, and owls, nailed by the wings, displayed, as they say in heraldry, against the wall, with polecats, weasels, stoats, and hedgehogs figuring at their side, a perfect menagerie of dead game killers. Footnote. Foxes, the destruction of which is so great an object in a pleasant preserve, never are displayed, especially if there be a pack of hounds in the neighbourhood. That odious part of a gamekeeper's occupation is as quietly and unostentatiously performed as any operation of gunnery can be. Lords of manors will even affect to preserve foxes, heaven forgive them, just as an unpopular ministry is sure to talk of protecting the liberty of the subject. End of footnote. But the prettiest part of this woodland cottage was the real living game that flitted about it, as tame as barn-door fowls. Partridges flocking to be fed, as if there were not a dog or a gun or a man in the world. Pheasants, glorious creatures, coming at a call. Hares almost as fearless as cowpers, that would stand and let you look at them, would let you approach quite near before they raised one quivering ear and darted off, and that, even then, when the instinct of timidity was aroused, would turn at a safe distance to look again. Poor pretty things, what a pity it seemed to kill them. Such was to be Willie's future habitation. The day after he entered upon his place, I had an opportunity of offering my double congratulations to the master on his new servant, to the servant on his new master. Whilst taking my usual walk, I found Thomas Lamb, Dick, Willie, and Fanny about halfway up the lane, engaged in the animating sport of unearthing a weasel, which one of the gipsy dogs followed into a hole by the ditch side. The boys showed great sportsmanship on this occasion, and so did their poor curs, who, with their whole bodies inserted into different branches of the burrow, and nothing visible but their tails, the one the long puggish brush of which I have already made mention, the other a terrier-like stump that maintained an incessant wag, the dogs continued to dig and scratch, throwing out showers of earth, and whining with impatience and eagerness. Every now and then, when quite gasping and exhausted, they came out for a moment's air, whilst the boys took their turn poking with a long stick or loosening the ground with their hands, and Thomas stood by, superintending and encouraging both dog and boy, and occasionally cutting a root or a bramble that impeded their progress. Fanny also entered into the pursuit with great interest, dropping here and there a word of advice, as nobody can help doing when they see others in perplexity. In spite of all these aids, the mining operation proceeded so slowly that the experienced keeper sent off his new attendant for a spade to dig out the vermin, and I pursued my walk. After this encounter, it so happened that I never went near the gipsy tent without meeting Thomas Lamb, sometimes on foot, sometimes on his pony, now with a gun and now without, but always loitering near the oak tree, and always, as it seemed, reluctant to be seen. It was very unlike Thomas's usual manner to seem ashamed of being caught in any place or in any company, but so it was. Did he go to the ancient Sibyl to get his fortune told, or was Fanny the attraction? A very short time solved the query. One night, towards the end of the month, the keeper presented himself at our house on justice business. He wanted a summons for some poachers who had been committing depredations in the preserve. Thomas was a great favourite, and was of course immediately admitted, his examination taken, and his request complied with. But how, said the magistrate, looking up from the summons which he was signing, how can you expect Thomas to keep your pheasants when that gipsy boy with his finders has pitched his tent just in the middle of your best coppices, killing more game than half the poachers in the country? Oh, why, as to the gipsy, sir, replied Thomas, Fanny is as good a girl. I wasn't talking of Fanny, interrupted the man of warrants, smiling. Oh, as good a girl, pursued Thomas. A very pretty girl, ejaculated his worship. As good a girl, resumed Thomas, as ever trod the earth. A sweet, pretty creature, certainly, was again the provoking reply. Oh, sir, if you could but hear how her little brother talks of her. Why, Thomas, this gipsy has made an impression. Oh, sir, she is such a good girl. And the next day they were married. It was a measure to set every tongue in the village a-wagging, for Thomas, besides his personal good gifts, was well-to-do in the world, my lord's head keeper and prime favourite. He might have pretended to any farmer's daughter in the parish, Everybody cried out against the match. It was rather a bold measure, certainly, but I think it will end well. They are beyond a doubt the handsomest couple in these parts, and as the fortune-teller and her eldest grandson have had the good sense to decamp, and Fanny, besides being the most grateful and affectionate creature on earth, turns out clever and docile, and comports herself just as if she'd lived in a house all her days, there are some hopes that in process of time her sin of gypsyism may be forgiven, and Mrs. Lamb be considered as visitable, at least by her next neighbours, the wives of the shoemaker and the parish clerk. At present, I am sorry to say that those worthy persons have sent both Thomas and her to Coventry, a misfortune which they endure with singular resignation. And now, since farewell must be said, I do not know that I can find a fitter moment. We are all as happy as people on a last page ought to be, the lovers in a union of affection, the rest of the village in the news and the wonderment. Farewell, then, courteous reader. To all, to each, a fair good night, and pleasant dreams, and slumbers light. End of chapter 23. End of Our Village, Volume 2, by Mary Russell Mitford. Read by Anne Fletcher, Queensland, 2023.